What if the archon's elements actually match the characters from that region? There's this odd little quirk about Genshin's character balancing that has always felt out of place to me, and I've seen a ton of people mention it too. Each nation is explicitly associated with one of the elements. Mondstadt is the nation of Anemo, Liyue is the nation of Geo, Inazuma is Electro, and so on. This association touches almost everything: the culture of the people who live there, the themes and emotions that each archon quest is intended to explore, even the landscape itself and the emotions it's designed to evoke. But one detail doesn't match the nation's element, and it always trips me up: which visions are given to the characters from that region. This happens almost every time. When we went to Fontaine, I couldn't help but imagine all the unique and interesting Hydro characters we were going to get. When Natlan came around, everyone was so excited to finally have a new Pyro off-fielder who would free us from Xiangling. I couldn't help it, even though Mondstadt and Liyue should have shown us that this was not the way it worked. But this got me wondering, what would each archon bring to the table if we kept their kit the same, but changed their element to match the most common in their nation? Mondstadt, of course, comes first. It's one of the worst offenders when it comes to this imbalance. 18 characters so far, excluding the archon himself, and only 2 have Anemo visions. There are 2 Geo and Hydro characters each, 3 Electro characters, 4 Pyro characters, and 5 Cryo. Maybe Venti was the Tsaritsa all along. So what would he be like if we changed his element? He actually poses a bit of a problem. Proper crowd control is more or less unique to Anemo, but it's so central to his kit that removing it entirely changes him a lot. Let's consider both options. If we keep his crowd control, it'd likely keep the fairly low multipliers on his talents, so his damage would not be all that impressive, especially since he would no longer benefit from the swirl reaction. However, he would still be an incredibly useful character. We have a fair few off-field cryo appliers already: Kaya, Rosaria, Chonyan, Layla, Charlotte, Shenhe, and even support Ganyu. But for the most part, either their focus is on some other part of their kit, or their application is fairly limited in duration or area of effect. Cryo Venti would apply a ton of cryo in a fairly generous area, and even more importantly, this version would group enemies together at the same time. He would be one of the most useful characters in the game, and melt teams especially would be much more viable than they are currently. On the other hand, if we were to remove his strong crowd control so that it remains exclusive to Anemo characters, then this kit would become much more focused. His damage multiplier would likely have to be significantly higher, and his role would be skewed towards off-field DPS, as well as providing extra value as a cryo applier and battery. Interestingly, we can come close to getting a feel for what this would be like by looking at an existing character, Ayaka. Her skill is vaguely similar to Venti's, and her burst is a powerful blizzard which hits many times, very similar to how I'd imagine this Venti's burst. The main difference is that Ayaka's burst has almost half the duration his would provide and a much longer cooldown. During the small window in which off-field Ayaka is actually doing something, she's fantastic. The reason this is not viable use for her is that her burst is only available 25% of the time. Venti's is available for over half of its cooldown, so it would be much more useful with many more characters. Venti's Constellations currently lean towards providing Anemo damage bonus plus resistance shred for Anemo and physical damage. Swapping these to give some buffs to Cryo in place of Anemo would further position him as a fantastic Cryo support character. Interestingly, his build would be completely different. His current ideal build is entirely tailored to the swirl reaction, full EM artifacts, and a 4-piece Viridescent Veneera set. So this would be a big change for him, since neither would have any real value for Cryo Venti. I'd picture people using him with builds focused on his personal damage, much like or Xiangling, though for the crowd control version, something to buff the rest of the team would probably be more useful. I'd most want to use him in melt teams. The big problem with melt teams so far is the lack of consistent long-lasting cryo applicator, and it feels like Cryo Venti would excel in that role. For example, a team using Arlecchino, Layla Bennett, and Cryo Venti would have absurd damage numbers, and more importantly, would be a ton of fun to play. This team is already great when used with characters like Kaya in place of Venti, but bringing the strength of an Archon to that role would take it to another level. Either of those Cryo Ventis would be so cool to have. I'd love for proper crowd control to no longer be so locked to Anemo. It would open up so much more potential for unique characters, but even the more basic version would make for some interesting teams. He'd arguably be less flexible than he is as the Anemo Archon, but since we already have Kazuha and Sucrose taking his place in most teams, I suspect he'd get more use in this alternate universe. As much as I appreciate Venti, I'd definitely swap him for either Cryo alternative. Next up is Liyue, another which is oddly unbalanced despite being Hoyo's favorite child who gets a new character every year. There are currently 20 characters from Liyue, soon to be 21 with the release of Lanyan. Liyue only has 2 Geo characters, equal lowest alongside Electro, Hydro and Dendro. There are currently 3 Liyue Anemo characters, 4 if we include Lanyan, and 4 Cryo characters. Finally, Liyue's most popular element is Pyro, again with 5 characters. Note that we're excluding Child here since he's technically from Shasnaya. He wouldn't change the result either way, but since his vision is not from Liyue, he doesn't count. Zhongli's main purpose is to be the premier shielder in the game, and while Geo shields do have some significant advantages, a Pyro Zhongli would be perfectly viable without other changes to his kit. His burst could even still be a meteor, it'd just be a gigantic fireball rather than a meatball. The more interesting consequence of this element flip is actually what he'd bring to the table with his skill. He summons a stone pillar, which activates a shield via the hold version, but more importantly, it applies his element. While the damage provided via his pillars is pretty low, we would finally have Xiangling replacement who could apply Pyro from off-field without being restricted to specific playstyles. Thoma is probably the best point of comparison here. He's a fantastic shielder who does apply Pyro from off-field, but his main downside is that his Pyro and his shield are limited to characters who use normal attacks. Pyro Zhongli would essentially be an upgraded version of Thoma, with a greater than 100% uptime on his Pyro application, a stronger and more reliable shield, decent damage potential via his burst, and some extra benefits like his elemental and physical damage resistance shred, which affects nearby enemies. Pyro Zhongli's Constellations would be largely unchanged. They provide more elemental application, a co-op shield, greater AoE for his burst, and healing for characters protected by his shield. In stark contrast to how different Cryo Venti's build was, Pyro Zhongli would have pretty much the same requirements as his original Geo incarnation. You'd still have a choice between building him for HP to maximize his shield, focusing on his burst damage output, or aiming for some hybrid of the two. He'd still work well with the same artifact sets, with the sole exception of the 4-piece archaic Petra, which would no longer work for him, but few people ever bother with that set in the first place. I would love Pyro Zhongli in Neuvillette teams. For example, those two with Xiangling and Furina would be incredible. While something like that team is currently possible while using Xiangling, the team's lack of shielding is problematic, especially when coupled with the short range of the Pyronado. Thoma does not work here at all since Neuvillette uses charge attacks instead of normals, so this is actually a team which is crying out for Pyro Zhongli. Pyro Zhongli would be a lot less flexible than Geo, and many teams would be worse off after this change. While it would be great to finally have a viable alternative to Xiangling, there are only a few teams where you'd really need someone else, especially since Thoma can cover some of them. There are a handful of teams which would really make great use of him, but honestly, does Neuvillette really need to be made stronger? Overall, while I like the idea, I think I'd stick with the original. And next, Inazuma. The Electro Nation bucks this trend. The main element is actually a joint favorite, so if we did include the archons in our count, Inazuma would have more Electro characters than any other element. Since we're excluding the archons, out of the 15 eligible characters Inazuma has, 1 Cryo, 1 Dendro, 2 Hydro, 2 Pyro, 3 Anemo, 3 Geo, and 3 Electro characters. Note that Wanderer is not included here since he has a Sumeru vision, while Chiori is because hers is from Inazuma despite her permanently living in Fontaine. Geo Raiden would honestly be a little underwhelming. She would be a basic Geo DPS, which would significantly limit her teams. She'd be about as flexible as Ito. She'd likely do decent damage, though since she scales of attack, she'd be slightly suboptimal fit with characters like Guru. In non-Geo teams, her skill would interfere with any potential reactions, so I'm pretty sure her Geo incarnation would be exclusively locked to hypercarry mono Geo playstyle. On the other hand, an Anemo Raiden would be really cool. In this version, her skill would be unique. We currently do not have any Anemo characters who provide coordinated attacks, which could make for some more interesting and creative uses for her. Her hypercarry playstyle would go one of two ways. A basic version of this would just be an Anemo damage dealer like Wanderer or Hazo, but it would be even more interesting if this would take some inspiration from Chaska and infuse each of her attacks with one of the elements from the other characters in the team. Even better if the big nuke at the start of her burst would also provide some crowd control, sucking enemies in towards her so that they're staggered and moved into her blast zone. Raiden's Constellations essentially all increase her damage output in some way, so they could, again, remain completely unchanged, regardless of which alternate universe version we're looking at. Her Geo version would be locked to her main DPS build, and she'd still likely be reliant on a 4-piece emblem. Anemo Raiden is more interesting. She'd still do great with a DPS emblem build, but she could also work with the full EM build, which currently optimizes her Hyperbloom damage. The difference here is that she'd be aiming to swirl. As an off-field support, she'd likely do fantastic swirl damage with the right build, and 4-piece Viridescent Venera would be a great option for her. While her Anemo version sounds pretty cool, especially if she had some multi-element infusion shenanigans like Chaska, I can't actually think of any new or unique teams that she'd unlock. Her coordinated swirls would be absolutely incredible in Taser or Soup teams, since you'd get all the benefits of having Anemo driver regardless of which character you use as a driver, but honestly, I could still see good old Raiden National remaining as her most popular team. I remain very happy with Raiden as she is currently. She's versatile and powerful and makes great uses of the strength of her element. The Geo version sounds extremely uninspiring and would likely be a massive downgrade. The Anemo version does sound pretty interesting and would bring some more unique aspects to the game, but in the end it's hard to see it being any more compelling than she is right now. Given the choice, I'd definitely stick with the Electro version. And next, Sumeru, the big exception. Since Dendro did not exist in the game until this region came out, it's natural that Sumeru has more characters from its signature element than any other. Out of Sumeru's 13 characters, there's 1 Pyro, 1 Cryo, 2 Anemo, 2 Hydro, 3 Electro and 4 Dendro characters even without including the Dendro Archon. Since Electro is in second place, let's look at the alternative universe version of Nahida, where she's the Electro Archon instead. Electro Nahida would honestly be both pretty cool and a bit pointless. Her skill would be fantastic for off-field Electro application and she'd easily compete with the best of the Electro off-field characters, but we already have Yae, Fischl, Beidou, Lisa and now Auroron, whose main purpose is to be Electro off-field DPS character, plus Dory and Cookie are pretty great in that role too despite being healers. Despite this, Electro Nahida would still provide a unique take on the role with even faster application and her chain effects, which would be very useful. Her advantages and disadvantages would remain and she'd still be a fantastic character, but even so, she still wouldn't stand out all that much. The main benefit she'd bring, which isn't currently available from Electro characters, ignoring 4P's instructors, is her EM buff. Nahida's Constellations would remain mostly the same, though it would be interesting to see the effect of her C2 if it were to be switched to focus on all Electro reactions. Electro Nahida would require a fairly similar build to the original, though leaning a little more strongly towards a more attack-focused build, which would make it a little tough to decide which stats to focus on. If she retained her EM buff, EM would still be pretty great for the entire team. Since her focus would be a little more skewed towards DPS in this incarnation, she would probably be best built with 4P's Golden Troop to maximize her damage. Ironically, Electro Nahida would be incredible in Dendro teams. She would share the disadvantages of the other Electro off-field DPS characters who are all of questionable utility in Hyperbloom due to not targeting Bloom cores, so she would probably be more viable in catalyzed teams than Hyperbloom. Her EM buff and copious Electro application would mean you could really get the most out of any Dendro DPS characters. For example, her with Alhaitham, Baizu, Kazuha would be an obscenely brilliant Quicken team. With her C2 on the other hand, she would be unparalleled in overloaded teams. Much like the original, Electro Nahida would be very flexible and work well in a ton of teams. While Electro Nahida is an interesting concept, this is a niche where we already have way too many options, so the original Flower Princess is clearly the better option here. After all, the one character who Electro Nahida would have the most synergy with would be Dendro Nahida herself. Finally, Fontaine. There are currently only 11 characters from the Hydro Nation. Lini, Lynette and Femine all have Fontainian visions despite their affiliation with the Fatui, while Arlekinos is from Snezhnaya and, as mentioned earlier, Chiuris is from Inazuma. When it comes to Fontaine vision holders, there are 1 each for Anemo, Dendro, Electro and Geo, 2 each for Pyro and Hydro, and 3 Cryo characters. So, Furina shall now compete with Venti for the Saritsa's crown. Furina is one of the best characters in the game, and the majority of her value is completely disconnected from her element. Cryo Furina's skill would still have 2 different versions. One would provide some consistent cryo application while draining the team's HP, while the other would remain unchanged as it only brings healing. Her burst would be similar too. Its initial flash of damage would be different, but its main purpose would be unchanged. This version of Furina would remain one of the most sought-after characters in the game due to her ludicrously powerful elemental damage buff, but this change would be a bit of a nerf overall. Hydro is widely considered the best element in the game since it's central to so many of the most powerful reactions, while in recent years Cryo has been left behind due to the introduction of many enemies who are resistant to being frozen. As with Cryo Venti, Cryo Furina would still be useful though, since one of Cryo's biggest flaws is the lack of dedicated off-field applier and sub-DPS, which is a role Furina would excel in. Her Constellations would be largely unchanged, though at C6 she would of course gain Cryo Infusion instead of Hydro one. At that point she'd be unstoppable in Freeze teams, just add a Hydro off-fielder or 2 plus either Charlotte or Jean to make a formidable team. Her build would also be pretty much identical. Her best in slot set would still be 4P's Golden Troop, since she would still provide a ton of damage via her skill. While it would be unusual to have a Cryo character who scales off HP, it doesn't feel quite so locked to Hydro that it would feel out of place. Much like Cryo Venti, I'd be most excited to use Cryo Furina to enable powerful melt teams. She would not work all that well with Arlecchino though, due to Father's resistance to healing. Instead, I'd want to use her with characters like Garming and Yanfei. They tend to apply way too much Pyro to be particularly comfortable in melt teams currently, so Cryo Furina's more long-lived application would be valuable here. Regardless of which element she has, Furina would remain one of the best characters in the game. With Cryo, she would really shine in a niche which remains a little underserved currently, but she would still be less useful than her current Hydro incarnation. Once again, I'd have to stick with the original. Since we're not even halfway through version 5 at this point, we'll leave Natlan for now. Though it's worth noting that at this point, thanks to Kachina and Shilonen, she would be the new Geo Archon. I'm pretty sure that, just like with Raiden, regardless of what her kit ends up being, a Geo version would be a clear downgrade. I guess that's just consequence of how Geo itself is flawed, and the Geo characters who are most useful tend to be the ones least tied to their element. So out of the 5 archons we looked at in this little thought experiment, most would still be interesting in this alternate universe, but the only one who I would pick over the current incarnation is Cryo Venti. And even that is more because he's fallen behind Kazuha and Sucrose in most teams. It's super fun to think about how a single change like this can have such a profound effect on how each character would interact with the rest of the combat system. And I think that goes to show how each archon's kit is indeed pretty well suited to their original element. They tend to lean into its strengths and often cover some of its flaws. It's still super weird that visions from each nation are so often skewed towards the wrong elements though. Until next time!